Once upon a time, in the grand courts of Herod's palace, a young girl walked among the marble pillars, her footsteps silent against the polished stone. Bernice had been born into a life of privilege, wrapped in the silks of royalty, raised under the watchful eyes of scholars and noblewomen, a princess by birth and by name. Yet, even as a child, she had known that her world was not built on love, but on power. Her father, Herod Agrippa I, ruled with a firm hand. His every decision a balance between pleasing the Roman Empire and keeping his own people from turning against him. He was a man who knew how to play the game of politics, how to say what men wanted to hear while quietly securing his own place of influence. And Bernice, the eldest of his daughters, the princess with dark eyes and a sharp mind, had learned early that her life was not her own. She had watched as her father made alliances not through trust, but through marriage. She had listened to the whispers in the corridors, the careful calculations of those who sought favor, the way love was spoken of as nothing more than a tool for power. And she had understood she would never marry for love. She would marry for strategy, for position, for control. Because that was what it meant to be born into a royal house. She had been married off as a young girl, barely past childhood, to a man who was older, wealthier, and far more concerned with his own ambitions than with the wife who had been given to him like a token in a bargain. And she had played her part well. She had smiled at the feasts, spoken in soft, measured tones, adorned herself in golden bracelets and perfumes from Egypt, every bit the queen she was expected to be. But deep inside, she had known the truth. She was not free. She was a piece in a larger game. A woman whose fate had been written for her before she had ever had a chance to decide it for herself. And when her husband had died, leaving her a widow before she had even learned what it was to be a wife, she had barely been given time to mourn before another arrangement was made. Another marriage, another move, another role to play. And so, she had done what she had always done, survived. But in surviving, she had become something else. A woman who no longer dreamed of love, but of control. A woman who understood that in a world ruled by men, her power lay not in her title, but in her ability to shape the minds of those who listened to her. A woman who knew that she had to be more than just a princess in silk robes. She had to be someone no man could ignore. And so by the time she was a woman grown, Bernice was no longer just Herod's daughter. She was a name that held power, a presence that commanded attention, a woman who had learned how to make even kings listen. But as she sat in the grand halls of her brother King Agrippa II's court, listening to the latest murmurs of unrest, she realized that for all her power, there was still something missing, something she could not name, something she could not control. And she hated it. Because she had spent her whole life ensuring that she was never at the mercy of anything she could not command. And yet, here she was, staring at a future she could not predict, caught between Rome and Jerusalem, between the power she held and the truth she had yet to understand. What was it all for? What was she really chasing? She did not know yet, but she would soon. Because in the days to come, she would meet a prisoner, a man who had no crown, no riches, no army. And yet, his words would shake the very foundations of the world she had built for herself, and she would never be the same. Bernice sat on the polished stone bench of the grand hall, draped in deep blue silk, her golden bracelets clinking softly as she toyed with them absent-mindedly. The palace was alive with movement. Officials whispering in corners, servants hurrying through the corridors, soldiers standing stiff at their posts, but she barely noticed them. Her brother, King Agrippa II, sat beside her on the raised platform, deep in conversation with the Roman Governor Festus. The two men spoke in hushed, serious tones, their faces shadowed with concern. She had been listening at first, half interested in the latest political tension between the Jewish leaders and the Roman authorities, but her mind had wandered until she heard a name: Paul. The sound of it sent an unexpected ripple through her chest, though she did not know why. She had heard whispers of him before, a man who once hunted followers of a new faith, but had now become its most outspoken defender. A man who preached of a resurrected king, a Messiah who had conquered death, a kingdom that was not built by Roman hands, but by something greater, something unseen. She had never met him, but his name had traveled far, stirring controversy, anger, fascination, and even fear. And now he was here, in chains, standing before her brother and Festus, a prisoner of Rome. She leaned in slightly, watching as Festus sighed heavily and shook his head. "I have found no crime in him worthy of death," he muttered. "But the Jewish leaders insist that he is dangerous." Agrippa raised a brow, adjusting the golden band on his wrist. "Dangerous?" he echoed, his tone amused. "And yet, he is still alive?" Festus smirked. "Not for lack of trying. They want him executed, but he has appealed to Caesar himself." Bernice straightened. "Caesar?" For a prisoner to appeal to Caesar, he had to be either a fool or a man who truly believed he was innocent. And judging by the way the name Paul had spread across the empire, stirring both devotion and hatred, she suspected it was the latter. Agrippa exhaled, thoughtful. "Then why bring him to me?" Festus gave him a weary look. "Because I need something to write. If I send him to Rome without a clear accusation, I'll look like a fool. The man talks in circles about a crucified Jew named Jesus, claiming he is alive." Bernice's fingers tightened slightly around her bracelets. Jesus! She had heard that name before, too. A man who had been crucified years ago under Pontius Pilate's rule. A teacher. A healer. A supposed king. She had thought his story had died with him. But if Paul was standing here today, still preaching his name, then perhaps the story had not ended after all. Agrippa leaned back, rubbing his jaw in consideration. "Bring him in," he finally said. "Let me hear this man for myself." Bernice did not react, but something inside her stirred with curiosity. Who was this Paul? And what kind of man stood before kings without fear, even in chains? The great doors of the hall swung open, and the prisoner was led inside. Bernice had expected someone weak, beaten down, a man who had been worn thin by imprisonment and hardship. But that was not what she saw. The man who stood before them was aged but strong, his shoulders squared, his gaze sharp. His hands were bound in iron, but his posture was that of a man who carried no shame, no fear, no doubt about why he stood there. He was not defeated. He was not begging for his life. He was a man who had already decided that his life did not belong to him. She studied him, searching for arrogance, for pride, for weakness, but found none. There was something unsettling about him. Something unshakable, as if even though he was in chains, he was the freest man in the room. Agrippa laced his fingers together, his expression unreadable. "Paul," he said slowly, "you have permission to speak for yourself." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to the prisoner. And then Paul smiled, a small, knowing smile, as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if he had expected this audience long before any of them had even thought of summoning him. And when he spoke, his voice did not tremble. It rang through the hall, steady and sure. "I consider myself fortunate, King Agrippa, that today I can make my defense before you." And as his words filled the air, Bernice felt something inside her shift. She did not know it yet, but this was the beginning. Not of Paul's trial, not of his defense, but of something far greater, something that would not end in this hall, nor in Rome, nor even in death, something that even she could not ignore. Bernice sat motionless on the high-backed chair beside her brother, her golden bracelets heavy against her wrists, but not as heavy as the words filling the room. The air was thick with an unusual tension, not the kind that came from political games or court intrigue, but something else, something deeper. Paul stood in the center of the hall, his chains glinting faintly in the torchlight, yet he did not seem like a prisoner at all. His presence filled the space in a way that no nobleman or king ever could. And when he spoke, it was as if the very walls leaned in to listen. "I was once like them." His voice was steady, unwavering, a stark contrast to the murmuring court officials who had grown silent the moment he began to speak. "I was once a man who hunted those who followed the name of Jesus. I thought I was righteous. I thought I was defending the traditions of our fathers. I thought I knew the truth." Bernice frowned slightly, shifting in her seat. She had heard many men defend themselves before judges, before kings, before the Roman courts, and it was always the same. Excuses, justifications, desperate attempts to preserve their own lives. But Paul, he was not defending himself at all. He was testifying. "I stood among the men who condemned the followers of the way. I gave my approval when Stephen was stoned to death. I traveled from city to city, seeking out those who dared to believe in this Jesus of Nazareth, determined to put an end to them." Bernice studied him, watching the fire in his eyes, the weight in his voice. There was no hesitation, no shame. He did not try to rewrite his past or hide from the things he had done. Instead, he spoke of them boldly, as if they were not just part of his story, but part of a much greater story, one that had begun long before he was ever born. She saw Agrippa tense slightly beside her, his face unreadable, though she could tell that he was listening intently. Paul had commanded even her brother's full attention, and that was no easy thing to do. But then, on the road to Damascus, everything changed. The room seemed to grow smaller as Paul's voice filled it, as if his words were pulling everyone toward him, trapping them in the weight of what was coming next. "A light brighter than the sun surrounded me, and I fell to the ground. And I heard a voice say, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' And I asked, 'Who are you, Lord?' And he answered, 'I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now get up, for I have appointed you to be my witness, to open the eyes of the blind, to turn them from darkness to light.'" Bernice's pulse quickened. She had heard many stories of gods and visions, of signs and omens. The Roman temples were filled with myths of men encountering the divine, but this was different. Paul did not speak of a dream, or a prophecy, or the words of a priest. He spoke as a man who had been marked by something he could never erase, something that had taken hold of him so completely that it had turned his entire life upside down. He had once hunted these followers of Jesus. Now he stood in chains because he had become one of them. Agrippa finally leaned forward, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest of his chair. "So let me understand you," he said slowly, his tone almost amused but edged with curiosity. "You saw a vision, heard a voice, and now you stand here claiming that this Jesus, who was crucified, is alive?" Paul turned his gaze toward the king, his expression steady, fearless. "I do not claim it, King Agrippa. I proclaim it. Jesus is alive, and because of him, I am no longer the man I once was." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some scoffing, others silent, uneasy. Bernice watched her brother carefully, knowing that this was a moment of decision. Agrippa was a man who enjoyed power, influence, control. He knew how to navigate the delicate balance between Rome and the Jewish people, how to keep both sides satisfied while ensuring his own rule remained untouched. But Paul had thrown that balance aside. He was not trying to preserve his life. He was trying to convince the very men who could condemn him that they needed saving instead. And Bernice could see it. Agrippa felt the weight of his words. Paul took another step forward, his chains clinking softly, but he carried himself like a man who wore a crown, not shackles. I stand here today, not because I have committed a crime, but because I have spoken the truth. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do. The court held its breath. Agrippa's mouth pressed into a thin line. He was a Herod, a ruler caught between two worlds, bound to Rome, yet raised in the traditions of his ancestors. And now, Paul had asked him a question that he could not answer without consequences. If he said yes, he would have to consider that perhaps Paul was right, that this Jesus truly was the Messiah foretold by the prophets. If he said no, he would deny the very scriptures that his people held sacred. And so he did what kings did best. He deflected. With a short, sharp breath, he leaned back and scoffed. "Paul," he said, shaking his head, "do you really think that in such a short time you can persuade me to become a Christian?" Paul smiled, and Bernice felt a strange chill at the expression on his face. It was not the smile of a man who had lost. It was the smile of a man who already knew the truth, whether Agrippa admitted it or not. "Short time or long," Paul said, "I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become as I am, except for these chains." The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. And for the first time in her life, Bernice felt something she did not recognize, something unfamiliar, something dangerous, not fear, not uncertainty, not even curiosity, but something deeper. Something that gnawed at the edges of everything she thought she knew. Could it be possible? Could this Jesus, a man who had died years ago under Pilate's rule, truly be alive? And if he was, what did that mean for her? She lowered her gaze, twisting her golden bracelet around her wrist. She did not have an answer, but she knew one thing. Paul's words would not leave her mind. Not today, not ever. Because truth has a way of chasing a person down, no matter how far they try to run. And Bernice, for the first time, was beginning to wonder if she had been running her entire life. Bernice stood beside her brother as the grand hall emptied, her face carefully composed, though her mind churned with thoughts she could not silence. The weight of Paul's words still lingered in the air, pressing down on her like an unseen force, heavy yet impossible to grasp. She had spent years in the courts of kings and governors, had listened to men argue over laws, kingdoms, and conquests, had watched rulers rise and fall, each one believing that their power was unshakable, their reign unending. But Paul, a prisoner in chains, a man who had nothing to his name, stood before them like a king in his own right. And what troubled her most was that he believed every word he spoke. He was not desperate. He was not afraid. He did not plead for mercy or attempt to manipulate his way to freedom. Instead, he had looked her brother in the eye and declared that the man they called Jesus was alive, as if it were a simple fact, not a belief, not a theory, but an undeniable, unshakable truth. A truth that, even now, would not leave her alone. Agrippa let out a breath, shaking his head as he turned toward Festus, who stood near the entrance of the hall, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "This man has done nothing deserving of death or imprisonment," Agrippa muttered. Festus scoffed. And yet here he stands, making a fool of himself before kings. Bernice glanced at Paul, still standing in the center of the room, still bound in chains, yet holding his head high as if he had already won a battle no one else could see. Festus sighed, his frustration evident. If he had not appealed to Caesar, we could have set him free. Agrippa nodded, but Bernice saw something in his eyes, something her brother would never say aloud. He had been shaken. Not outwardly, not in a way that anyone would dare to challenge, but she knew him too well. Paul had said one thing too many, had spoken one truth too boldly, and now Agrippa could not forget it either. Bernice pressed her lips together, torn between relief and unease. The trial was over. Paul would be sent to Rome, and soon enough, his name would fade, his voice would be silenced, his claims buried under the weight of time and politics. And yet, she could not shake the feeling that this was not the end of his story. And worse, it was not the end of hers, either. As the hall emptied, she walked slowly behind Agrippa, her fingers grazing the smooth marble walls, her thoughts tangled in ways they had never been before. Her whole life had been about power, position, and survival, about making sure that she was always in the right place, always attached to the right people, always playing the game better than anyone else. But Paul had thrown the game aside entirely. He had stood before them with nothing, no wealth, no army, no influence, and yet he had spoken as if he already possessed everything he needed, as if he had already won. And deep inside, a whisper she could not silence asked a question she was not ready to face. What if he is right? What if Jesus truly was alive? What if this kingdom Paul spoke of was real? What if, for all the wealth, all the power, all the influence she had spent her life chasing, she was the one who had nothing? That night, sleep did not come easily. She lay in her chambers, staring at the flickering light of the oil lamp, listening to the sound of the wind against the stone walls, but her mind was still in that hall, still caught in the weight of Paul's words, short time or long. I pray to God that you may become as I am, except for these chains. Why had he said that? Why had he looked at her brother, at her, at the entire court filled with power and nobility, and pitied them, while he, a prisoner, a man in shackles, stood before them unshaken? She had seen men break under pressure. She had seen warriors beg for mercy, rulers betray their own, criminals weep for their lives. But Paul had done none of that, and that frightened her more than anything, because only a man who had seen something greater than this world could stand before kings without fear. And if he was right, if Jesus truly had conquered death, then everything she had built her life on was a lie. She squeezed her eyes shut, turning on her side, willing the thoughts away, willing herself to forget the way he had spoken, the way his words had taken root in a place of her heart she had long buried. But truth has a way of chasing a person down no matter how far they try to run, and Bernice was beginning to realize that she could not outrun this. Not anymore. The palace was quiet in the early morning, the soft glow of dawn casting long shadows against the stone walls, but Bernice found no comfort in the silence. She sat near the open window of her chamber, staring out at the city below, her mind still tangled in the words Paul had spoken the day before. She had tried to push them away, to drown them in the noise of royal affairs, in the distractions of politics and power, but they followed her, whispering in the back of her mind, unsettling her in ways she could not name, short time or long. I pray to God that you may become as I am, except for these chains. That one sentence refused to leave her. It haunted her not because of what he had said, but because of how he had said it, as if he was the one who was truly free, And they, the rulers of the land, were the ones who lived in chains. She could not understand it. She had spent her whole life securing her place in the world, ensuring that she would never be powerless, never be at the mercy of men who saw women as nothing more than a means to an end. And yet, Paul had nothing. Yet he had spoken like a man who had everything. And for the first time in her life, she wondered if she had been wrong about everything. She rose from her seat and moved to the doorway where two servants stood, their heads lowered. "Where is my brother?" she asked. "In the council chamber, my lady," one of them answered. "He is speaking with Governor Festus." Bernice nodded and started down the hall, her sandals making soft echoes against the polished floor, her mind still lost in thoughts she could not escape. When she reached the chamber, she paused just outside, listening. She could hear Agrippa's voice, low and thoughtful, followed by Festus's impatient sigh. "This man should have been set free," Agrippa was saying. "If he had not appealed to Caesar, we could have released him." "He brought this upon himself," Festus replied. "But let Rome deal with him now." A silence followed. Then, Agrippa's voice came again, quieter this time. "He is different." Bernice's breath caught. She had known her brother long enough to recognize the hesitation in his tone, the way it lowered when he was considering something he did not wish to admit. Festus let out a scoff. "Different? He is a madman, Agrippa. A fool who speaks of visions and resurrected kings. His followers are growing, yes, but it will not last. It never does." Another pause, and then Agrippa spoke words that made Bernice's hands tighten at her sides. "Perhaps. But what if he is right?" The room fell into deep silence. Bernice closed her eyes, her chest tightening with something close to fear. If Agrippa, a man of logic, a ruler, a politician who was skilled at maneuvering through the shifting sands of power, was asking such a question, then it meant that he, too, had felt it. The weight of Paul's words, the strange, unsettling certainty in his voice, the feeling that, though he stood in chains, he was not the one in captivity. And now, Bernice knew. She was not the only one who could not forget what he had said. She stepped forward then, pushing open the doors. Agrippa and Festus both looked up as she entered, their conversation halting instantly. Agrippa's eyes narrowed slightly. "You were listening." She did not deny it. Instead, she lifted her chin, her voice calm, but laced with something neither of them had ever heard from her before. "Tell me, my brother," she said slowly, "why does this man trouble you so?" Festus sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "He does not trouble us, Bernice. He is a nuisance, nothing more." But Agrippa did not speak, and that was answer enough. She took another step forward, her gaze never leaving her brother's. "You said, what if he is right?" She let the words hang in the air between them. "Have you thought about what that would mean?" Agrippa exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Bernice, do not let this consume your thoughts." "And yet," she countered, her voice sharp, "it consumes yours." For the first time, her brother had no response. She looked between them, these two rulers, these men who held the power of Rome and the favor of the people, yet who now stood uneasy because of the words of one prisoner. Paul had shaken them. He had shaken her. And though they would send him away, though they would rid themselves of his presence, she knew that he had already done what he had come to do. He had planted a question in their hearts, one that would never go away. That night, Bernice lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her chambers. Her thoughts, a battlefield. she could not escape. Paul's words replayed over and over again. Jesus is alive. I pray that you may become as I am, except for these chains. What if he is right? She had spent her whole life believing that power, wealth, and influence were the things that made a person secure. But Paul, a man with nothing, was more certain, more unshaken, more at peace than any ruler she had ever known. And now, she could not unsee it. She could not unhear it. She could not forget it. For the first time in her life, Bernice felt afraid. Not of Rome, not of losing power, not of the whispers of men, but of the truth. Because if Jesus was truly alive, if his kingdom was real, then everything she had built her life upon was nothing but dust, and that was something she was not ready to face. Not yet. But deep down, she knew that the truth would not leave her alone. Not now, not ever. The torches in the great halls burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the cold stone walls of the palace. The night was quiet, yet Bernice felt no peace. She stood on the open balcony, gripping the edge of the stone railing, staring up at the vast, endless sky, where the stars burned with an ancient, unmoving certainty. Her whole life, she had measured power by what could be held, counted, and controlled. Power was in gold, in alliances, in the weight of a crown, and the fear it commanded. But now, as she stood in the depths of the night, Paul's words would not let her go. Short time or long, I pray to God that you may become as I am, except for these chains. Why had he said that? Why had he looked upon kings, upon rulers of the world, and spoken to them as if he were the one with the true power? And why did she believe him? She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, willing herself to silence the voice in her mind, the one that whispered of things she did not want to face, of questions she did not want to answer. What if Paul was right? What if Jesus was alive? What if the kingdom he spoke of, the one not built by men, not bound by Rome, not secured by wealth or war, was real? And if it was, what did that mean for her? Bernice had spent her entire life playing the game of power, ensuring that she was always on the right side of history, always tied to the right people, always securing her place among rulers and kings. But Paul was different from any man she had ever met. He had no throne, no armies, no wealth. And yet, he was unshaken, as if he carried something greater inside of him than all the rulers of the world combined. She had never seen a king stand with such certainty. Not Rome, not her father, not even her brother, who was so determined to dismiss everything Paul had said, yet could not fully hide the doubt in his eyes. And that doubt, it terrified her. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned to see Agrippa standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his robe draped loosely over his shoulders as if he, too, had been unable to sleep. They stared at each other in silence for a moment before she finally spoke. You don't believe him? It wasn't a question, but Agrippa hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. He exhaled, stepping forward, resting his hands on the railing beside her. Does it matter? Bernice studied him, searching his face for something. Anything. That could ground her, that could pull her back from the edge of this feeling she could not escape. But there was nothing. Because even her brother, with all his logic, all his control, could not answer the question Paul had left hanging in the air. What if he is right? She turned back toward the city, watching the lights flicker in the distance. For years, she had prided herself on being in control of her own fate, on securing a future that was untouchable by the whims of men or the tides of war. And yet now, she felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted, as if the very foundation she had built her life upon was suddenly cracking. What if everything she had chased after, everything she had fought to secure, was dust? What if Paul, a man in chains, a man Rome mocked, a man whose followers were hunted and imprisoned, was freer than she had ever been? She swallowed hard, her fingers pressing into the cold stone, her pulse steady but quick. And then her brother spoke again. "If we listen to him, Bernice," Agrippa said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "everything changes." She turned her head slightly, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for the answer that she already knew. "Yes," she murmured, "it does." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The night stretched before them, vast and silent, as if even the stars themselves were waiting. Waiting for a decision, waiting for a choice, waiting for them to decide which kingdom they would belong to. And though Agrippa finally turned and walked away, retreating back into the palace as if nothing had happened, Bernice remained. She could not walk away. Not yet. Because the truth had found her now, and truth, once seen, could never be unseen. She had spent her life securing the power of kings, but now she had glimpsed the power of something greater, and she knew deep down that it would never let her go. Not now, not ever.